Welcome. In this video, I would like to return to the topic of critical thinking, but this time address it within the context of critical reading. Both critical thinking and critical reading are skills vital to success in college, and I'll do my best to help you understand these two concepts so that you can practice them for yourself. Let's get started. I'm going to use a Microsoft PowerPoint presentation to guide me to make sure I stay on track as I present my comments. Critical thinking and critical reading are vital to your academic success, and they are terms that your professors will likely use in many of your classes. So it's helpful to understand, what do your professors mean when they use these terms? I define critical thinking to my students as the recognition of biases and preferences, to include prejudices, so as to mitigate their effect on the creation of information during the evaluation of data at hand. Meaning, thinking about the data, being skeptical of the data, of the source of the data, of the applicability of the data to one's research needs. It's being aware of not accepting data prima facie, at face value, that the data, the source of the data, the quality of the data, the currency, meaning how old the data is, all of these and many more characteristics need to be evaluated. That one should literally be critical of the data. Critical thinking can also simply be described as skeptical thinking, being skeptical of data and their origin, seeking the evidence through which one could consider the data valid and appropriate for a given research need. Now, critical thinking is defined in many different ways. I came upon my definition of critical thinking because I like to reflect the general definitions of critical thinking, or the general characteristics that are evident in most definitions of critical thinking. So, if in any textbook that you're reading, the definition of critical thinking differs from mine, I encourage you to demonstrate your own critical thinking and to see how the definition in the textbook aligns or disagrees with my definition, because that's really what critical thinking is. Critical thinking has myriad benefits, but the two that I think are most important are it helps one to avoid reaching a conclusion or a judgment that's not defended by the available evidence. Rather than judging something to be true without evidence, or to judge something to be not true without evidence, is, I think we can honestly just consider that inappropriate, not clear, not good thinking. Critical thinking allows one to look at the quality of the evidence and to make an informed judgment as to whether the evidence supports any given conclusion. The second principal value of critical thinking to me is it avoids the common habit of confirmation bias. We as humans naturally seek to acquire data, information that confirms, supports, aligns with the biases that we already have. For example, I like to be around people who are similar to me. I like to listen to political discourse that is in agreement with my political preferences. I like to listen to cultural descriptions or read. This doesn't have to be only oral, it can be in writing. I like to read texts that agree with the opinions that I currently hold. However, when I read data that is in agreement with my current biases, I don't really grow. I don't learn to I don't learn new things. I don't acquire a different perspective on phenomena. So therefore, good critical thinking can help me and help you understand the world through a different lens or different lenses. To think critically, one must be skeptical. One should not accept a claim without appropriate evidence, and the evidence itself should be appropriate for the current research process. Is the data current? Is the data from an expert source? Is the data really aligned with the claim such that the data serves as evidence of the claim? Honestly, the downside to critical thinking is once you begin to practice it intentionally as a college student, you're going to find it very difficult to interact with many popular information sources. You will find it difficult to watch the news on TV or listen to the news through a podcast. You will find yourself saying, wait, you can't make that claim, dear reporter. You haven't defended your claim. You've offered a statement that you want me to accept as fact. Where's the evidence? Or just to show my own age, where's the beef? I want to avoid the discussing what true means. For the purposes of this video, can we just accept that the word true means acceptable? And so critical thinking also requires one to slow down. One of the common mistakes that I see college students make is that they rush their thinking process. They rush to make a conclusion, to have an answer. Academic study really values asking questions rather than contriving or finding answers. Yes, you have to answer questions on a test. I get that. Yes, you have to reach conclusions when doing research. But the real value in the research process is asking the question and seeking to find evidence that leads one toward, but not always to, a conclusion or a judgment. The concentration that we give to our academic work should be focused on evaluating the data rather than using the data to create an answer. Critical thinking also requires that we recognize when we are having an emotional reaction and to avoid allowing emotions to cloud the logical judgments that we can make. For example, I hate to keep talking about politics, but That's where I tend to get most emotional. Over the last 6 years or so, I have frequently had emotional reactions to news um, related to American politics. Now, for a good portion of that time, I was living abroad. So I was influenced by talking to my friends and acquaintances in Europe about American politics. Because unlike in America, where we often don't talk politics with strangers, and I found it, at least in Germany, it was very common for people in the park to strike up a conversation about American politics with me because they knew I was American. And I had to force myself to recognize when I was having an emotional reaction and not allow my emotions to cloud the my application of logic in my analysis of what was taking place in American politics. Okay, that's a requirement of critical thinking. It's to recognize that we are emotional beings. These emotions naturally affect us. And can we recognize our emotional reactions so as to mitigate their effect on our application of logic? That really is a core requirement of critical thinking. When you're doing your academic research, you will come upon data that contradicts whatever you think is true. How are you going to deal with it? Go ahead, have the immediate emotional reaction, but then I ask you to recognize that you are having an emotional reaction to contradictory information, and then seek to keep it within the perspective of the empirical evidence that you have before you. Maybe it will require seeking additional empirical data so that you can create a better frame of reference for the contradictory data that's before you. Okay, so what is critical reading and how is it related to critical thinking? Critical reading is seeking to identify the claims that are presented within a text and the evidence presented in defense of the claims. In other words, what are the arguments, the claims, and their evidence that go together? What are the arguments that the author is presenting? And how well are the arguments presented? So a claim is a proposition. It's something presented to the reader or the listener that the source requests the receiver, the listener or the reader, to accept. Evidence is data that are presented in defense of the claim, such as to make the claim more persuadable to the receiver. Together, they're called an argument. Now, without getting into the Toolman model or some of the other models of argumentation, there are more elements to an argument. But for right now, I'll keep it simple. A claim plus evidence are the two minimum requirements to make a logically complete argument. Critical reading requires evaluating the argument's forms. What is the evidence? Is it appropriate for the context? Is it current? Is it from an expert source? Is it aligned with the claim? Did the author present alternative and contradictory claims to the one that the author wishes you to accept. A good argument will recognize that it is not something, the claim is not something to be accepted prima facie, that it must have evidence that defends the claim, and that there are potentially alternative, and in many cases, contradictory claims that must also be evaluated. During critical reading, it's also vital that you seek to understand what are the ambiguities and what are the assumptions that the source has made. What data, what information has been left out? And then ask yourself, why did the author leave those data out of the argument? Why were they not acknowledged as either contradictory or ancillary data that doesn't directly support the claim? When you read closely and critically, you're able to make judgments about the data that are presented in evidence of a claim. You can judge whether or not that evidence is in support of your research question. Now, I don't mean support in that context in the sense of evidence for, but does the data align with your research needs? If you remember back from a previous video in which I was describing evaluating data sources, I acknowledged that in one of my classes, students have been given an assignment to research social media, and they were required to consider at least one government report. The students in those classes were addressing the use of social media by an American company, but used data from the Australian government. So, at face value, you might say, sure, the students found a government document related to social media. But I then challenged the students and I asked them, why do you think data from the Australian government is related to the actions of an American social media company? And I have yet to have a student make a logically complete correlation between the data from the Australian government and the American social media company. So those students had to find an American government source that more closely aligned with their current research needs. And that's through critical reading. Had the students critically read the Australian government report, they would have recognized that these data may be valid, but are they appropriate to the current research question, which dealt with the American use of social media? Critical reading will require that you slow down and think about the data that you're reading. Not just read the text to acquire facts, but to ask yourself, are these facts appropriate to my current research needs? When you critically read, you'll have to compare data from multiple sources. A single source of data is difficult to trust. Now, yes, we might argue that the source is considered such a high expert that I'm willing to accept the validity, the accuracy, the precision, the applicability of the data because I so highly value the source. But that often doesn't happen during academic research. Generally, you will be reviewing sources with which you're not directly familiar. Therefore, seek to understand where there is consensus among expert sources. When sources agree on data or agree on a conclusion, the acceptability of that conclusion or of those data is increased. A good example of this is during the recent coronavirus pandemic. Yes, I want to trust information from the Centers for Disease Control, but I understand that the researchers at the CDC are under multiple external pressures. So I also look for data from European sources and Asian sources. And I look to see where the medical experts or the virologists are offering conclusions that are in agreement. That's the data that I'm most likely to accept. And I read between the lines of medical reports, just as I'm going to ask you to read between the lines of the data that you read during each of your academic research projects. What data has been presented? What data has been omitted? And seek to understand why data have been omitted. I'm going to offer a few articles related to critical thinking and critical reading that I think you might find useful. I didn't cite these in my presentation, so I'm offering them just as a bibliography. And I'll pause for a few seconds on each page so that you can read the sources. I don't think I'm going to be able to include all of these in the description from this video because I'm limited to the number of characters that I can put into the description. But I'm hoping that you'll be able to pause your video here and read these for yourself. Critical thinking and critical reading are vital to your academic success. They are skills that you can practice. I encourage you to take on a personal research project to understand critical thinking and critical reading more deeply and practice using these skills in each of your academic research projects. I look forward to seeing you in a future video, and I wish you the absolute best as you think and read critically in your academic work. Bye for now.